It's a delight to be here with Professor Elias Sachs, who is professor at University of Colorado Boulder and has been quite prolific and is well known for many of his works, including those on Mendelssohn. Wonderful works there. Thanks for taking time to talk.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be kind of learning and thinking with you.
Awesome. So both in traditional yeshivot and in more pluralistic communal Jewish educational institutions, it's rare to see philosophy, not even Jewish philosophy, as part of the curriculum. What do you think is the concern there? And is philosophy itself something of a danger?
Yeah. So I think part of why philosophy is seen as being dangerous, part of why this concern is that there actually are dangers associated with philosophy. And I think if you kind of look at the history of Jewish philosophers, we can imagine at least two ways of thinking about that danger. One way of thinking about the danger is that philosophy is too effective, right? It's too good at raising questions. It's too good at disturbing our religious lives, right? Maimonides is a good example of a philosopher who knows this worry. While he's very much a defender of philosophy, he thinks philosophy matters a great deal, he recognizes that philosophy is dangerous. It can actually challenge people's basic convictions, and he's worried that for most people, philosophy is going to be unproductive. It's going to raise questions that they're going to have neither the time nor the ability to answer. This is part of why he writes in this kind of esoteric way. So that's a worry that suggests that philosophy is too effective.
Right.
There's also, though, a worry which suggests that philosophy is dangerous because it's ineffective, right? Not because it works, but because it doesn't work. Right. The problem with philosophy is that it actually can't accomplish what it promises to accomplish. Philosophy promises to kind of cultivate habits of questioning, habits of thinking, but it actually can't do that. It's so obscure, so esoteric, so technical that it actually can't speak to the ordinary person. The Jewish philosopher who I think most effectively expresses this worry is an early 19th century Eastern European thinker named Nachman Krachmal. Largely forgotten today, but important figure in the Eastern European Jewish Enlightenment. And Krachmal is very explicit that for all that he thinks philosophy matters, he doesn't think it's particularly effective unless part of a much broader educational curriculum. He thinks that in the end, philosophy is so technical and obscure, most people are going to hear it, throw up their heads and so what, and go on their lives as if they'd never encountered philosophy. So there are two different ways of thinking.
I wonder if a third possible concern is that Jewish philosophy is too intertwined with Jewish theology, that it can't compete in the broader world of philosophy. And thus, to introduce Jewish philosophy into our world will almost be too amateurish. Do you have a sense of that?
So I think that's a worry you sometimes see outside the Jewish world, in the academic sphere. You sometimes, I think, see among academics a kind of Jewish philosophical inferiority complex, a worry that the Jewish tradition doesn't have the kind of serious philosophical thinkers that you have in Western philosophy more generally, that you have in the history of Christian theology. I think the kind of maybe version of that worry you have in Jewish contexts is a sense that it's not that Jewish philosophy is going to be seen as amateurish as much as it's going to be a dangerous way for these more sophisticated non-Jewish thinkers to be smuggled into the Jewish tradition, right?
Okay, interesting.
Not incorrectly, lots of important Western philosophers are seen as threatening to Judaism, either because they raise questions or because they actually think pretty terrible things about Jews. And so I tend to think that's more of the worry in some Jewish contexts.
So, just an example, like the fact that Maimonides is really almost plagiarizing Al-Farabi, to get through to the Greeks, and and that's just one example of, or those who bring Kant in through the back door. So I want, by the way, are the only three Jewish philosophers that would be quoted in outside of Jewish context Maimonides, Spinoza, and Levinas? Or would you say there's others who are really speaking from within the Jewish context but are also relevant beyond?
So I think it depends on the kind of context you're talking about. I think there are some contexts where a figure like Moses Mendelssohn is going to be invoked. He's a kind of very short version of the history of philosophy would say that until we get to Kant, so in the 1780s, we thought we could do things like prove the existence of God, prove the immortality of the soul. And then Kant shows up and gives us a variety of reasons for thinking we can't do that. Mendelssohn is often cited as the last great thinker who made the case that we could do things like that. So Mendelssohn is sometimes cited. You have some figures like Martin Buber who get cited in non-Jewish philosophical
interesting.
contexts as well, although the debates about how much we should think of Buber as a philosopher versus as a more poetic thinker. Someone like Rosenzweig will get cited, although often more in kind of Christian contexts.
Existentialist, Christian existentialism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or for people interested in Jewish Christian
I took
dialogue.
an educational course on dialogue, and Buber was a big part of it, yeah. I wonder if also there's some post-Holocaust thinking that emerges.
Right.
So with all of the risks that are real that come with this engagement, what is the benefit that can be gained with philosophical inquiry?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think there are a couple of kind of benefits. One might be something like coherence, right? So, again, to take Maimonides, who's deeply aware of and worried about the dangers of philosophy, what bothers him, what leads him to push people towards philosophy, or part of what leads people to push him towards philosophy, is a sense that, you know what, some of us are going to have a kind of exposure to non-Jewish ways of thought. Those ways of thought are going to be compelling. And if that stands in tension with Judaism, that's going to be a problem. We actually, as human beings, can't think two, or ought not to think two contradictory things, right? It's hard for me to think both X and not X. It's hard for me to think both God couldn't have written the Torah and God did write the Torah. It's hard for me to think God created the world in 6 days and God created the world in much more than 6 days through some kind of evolutionary process. So one benefit of philosophy is kind of coherence, right? It's a mode of investigation that lets us address those serious incompatibilities between different modes of thinking. I think another kind of benefit is, at least some thinkers think there are real dangers that come from not engaging in philosophical thinking, far more serious than incoherence.
Or such as Maimonides' idea that actually you might never comprehend what this is all about. Right.
Or even more seriously, right, you might think you've comprehended but think the wrong things, right? So imagine that I come up with an incorrect picture of God. Imagine I haven't engaged in philosophy and I come up with a kind of incorrect picture of God, and when I pray, I have in mind that image of God. Well, we have a term for people who worship fictitious beings of their own creation rather than the actual God, and that word is idolater. We might worry that actually you become an idolater if you don't engage in philosophy, if you have an incorrect conception.
Rev Kook has this idea that belief can actually be heresy, and doubt or skepticism can actually be a deeper form of belief. So I think that that's really important. And one could argue that one of the most fundamental values of religion is actually a consistent quest for wisdom, if done in that path. And if that's the case, then it needs to be open. But the fears of openness are real. In fact, I think just looking at what happens in modernity with choice emerges, and the truth is most will choose to opt out. Most will with the option of choice, but what's the integrity of a system without choice? So what would it mean for contemporary Jewish communal life for us to really take Jewish philosophy seriously?
So I think it would mean that lots of people would have to be willing to take risks upon themselves, both on the communal side of things, and I think actually on the philosopher side of things, on the scholar side of things. So on the community side of things, people would have to be willing to be troubled, right? Philosophy is troubling. I remember I years ago gave a course in a synagogue called Does God Care About Our Prayers? Where we looked at different kinds of philosophical views on can God change? Does God respond to human beings? Does God feel emotions? And we looked at a number of thinkers, Maimonides being one of them, who raised real serious questions about whether it makes sense at all to think in those terms, whether it makes sense at all to think of God as caring or hearing or responding. And I felt very good after teaching the session. I had complicated people's ways of being. I had raised questions. I was feeling very proud. And a woman came up to me afterwards. She had been in the room and she had tears coming out of her eyes, and she said, look, this was really hard for me. I had lost a child. I had gone through a difficult divorce, and part of what got me through this was a sense that there was a God out there listening and caring and hearing. And this wasn't someone who was kind of in a reactionary way telling me, look, I don't want to hear this. This was someone who had actually taken me seriously, was being intellectually vulnerable, and I caused her real pain. And I think first of all, for communities to take philosophy seriously, we'd have to figure out ways to deal with that pain. We'd have to come up with educational and communal structures where people could both take philosophy seriously, but also, I think, kind of reconstitute their religious lives afterwards.
Yeah, that's great. We talk in psychotherapy that it can be like an act of violence to strip someone's foundation without providing some other place to stand. So, I was recently giving a session on Olam Haba to a group of seniors on Jewish approaches to afterlife. And I had a similar experience where a woman after said, you mean it's not going to be, So I said, I don't know what it's going to be. I'm just, but I think that, it is very heavy work, and you're someone who represents, understanding the gravitas of what it means to enter that world. Yeah.
Well, I think it's also worth noting that there are different kinds of dangers that actually face someone like me in that context, right? So it's unlikely I'm going to show up in that context and sort of not be able to figure out how to, or not be able to at least sort of comfortable asking those questions, right? I've, for better or for worse, chosen that much of my life is going to be devoted to asking those questions.
Yeah.
I do think, though, the danger on the philosopher side or on the scholar side is actually how do we kind of professionally find the space to engage in that.
Right.
Many of us who study Jewish
That's
philosophy do so from an academic environment, and it's an academic environment that doesn't tend to reward us for spending time in Jewish communal contexts, right? When we think about the realities of academic life, where you need to be publishing, where you need to be speaking, it's not immediately obvious that Jewish communities are the first place academic institutions are going to reward. So I think there's a little bit of risk as well for scholars. We need to decide that this matters enough for us, that we are willing to forego other kinds of speaking opportunities, other kinds of writing opportunities, and participate in these communal endeavors. I don't want to equate that danger with the danger that this person who attended my class took, right? That was a kind of existential danger. But I do think that we need to recognize on the philosophy side that if we're really committed to Jewish philosophy playing a role in Jewish communal life, we need to kind of put our money where our mouths are and take steps to do that.
One of the barriers, I think, is that we live in a world of advocacy today. People either want to know, is this presenter going to be left in Israel or right in Israel? Are they going to give us a cultural Judaism or a religious Judaism, as opposed to the integrity of surveying ideas without necessarily advocating? Because I think one of the risks that emerges is the integrity when one is the most philosophically trained in the room, where others actually can't challenge or have access to what's being brought. And I've seen that many times in religious fundamentalist circles, where someone has some philosophy background, is teaching people who just soak it up as if this is, Torah Sinai, and in secular perspective, someone who tries to shatter all the religious truths without having any sort of any kind of counter arguments.
There are sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There are many things that those of us who study philosophy are bad at. There are many things that those of us who are academics are bad at. One of the things we are the worst at is being humble. And actually recognizing that it's not our job, or at least from my perspective, it's not our job to go into communities and tell people what to think. If we can do anything useful in communities, I think what we can do is help people do a better job of asking the questions they already want to be asking. This is actually one of the reasons I mentioned Krachmal earlier. So I'm now working on Krachmal, and one of the reasons I'm intrigued by him is that kind of sense really animates his thought, right? So he's very explicit in the one book he writes that he is not going to write in technical philosophical language. He's going to write in the language of the Jewish tradition because he thinks that language is more accessible to people, that language is more real to people, and his job is not to overwhelm people with the brilliance of what he does. His job is to actually begin where communities are and put his own intellectual priorities on hold of it. And that's something that I think we as students of Jewish philosophy need to do a better job at. We need to do a better job at putting our own intellectual concerns and our own passions in the background and meeting communities where they are.
Amazing. So many are familiar, or some are familiar with some of our more traditional Jewish philosophers. If we zoom into the 21st century, or even the 20th, what would you say are three of the more influential Jewish philosophies of our time that have gained some influence? And not, what are essentially the frameworks we're operating with now?
So maybe there are. Let me highlight two of those
Okay,
frameworks,
great,
because
great.
there are some 20th and 21st century thinkers whose names are better known to
Right,
people. People
right.
know Buber and Rosenzweig and Levinas, and those are fantastic. I don't mean to minimize
Right.
those
Yes.
those thinkers. Let me
Yes.
maybe name two frameworks for and people also know a lot of post-Holocaust
Right.
thinking. Let me maybe name two thinkers who I see as exemplifying broader models
Great.
that I think could be relevant for us.
Great.
The first model is actually a thinker that I think we're going to be speaking about tonight in tonight's session, named Michael Wischergrad. Michael Wischergrad was a 20th and into the 21st century, he died in 2015, modern Orthodox thinker who was interested in lots of things. One of his real interests was in a kind of Jewish-Christian dialogue that isn't just a nice way of communities getting along better.
Right.
That isn't just a matter of, look, we all need to live with one another,
Right.
so if we know a little bit more about one another, we're less likely to kill one another.
Right.
He was really committed to the idea that Jews can be better Jews by learning about Christianity, and Christians can be better Christians by learning about Judaism. Kind of interreligious dialogue as a religiously necessary project for one's own tradition. There's the idea that Judaism matters for Christianity, Christianity matters for Judaism. I think that's a really productive framework for us to think about, to begin to ask the question of why other traditions matter to us, not just because we should know a little bit about our neighbors, but actually we can only make sense of our own tradition in conversations with others. I think then the other, and maybe even more important development in the 20th century that's continuing in all sorts of ways into the 21st century is feminist Jewish thought.
Right.
You know, my gateway into feminist Jewish thought with Judith Plaskow and her famous book Standing Again at Sinai. But I think some of the most dynamic, interesting work going on in Jewish thought right now is in the area of feminist Jewish thought. I want to highlight my friend and colleague Mara Benjamin's recent book on kind of maternal subjectivity in Jewish thought. I think that's another model for Jewish philosophy into the 21st century, right? Rather than thinking of philosophy as this disembodied project where these isolated intellects inquire into timeless truths, we can situate our philosophy in as embodied contexts as possible, in gendered contexts, in contexts relating to sexuality. I think that's another model for Jewish thought today.
Wow, I feel like we could have a whole other conversation about surveying the various fields today. So my last question for you, a question about spirituality.
Sure.
One of the projects I think we're in is breaking down certainty. Making it a little less clear in order to perhaps get it more clear or perhaps not. But how can one deeply embrace intellectual skepticism and philosophical inquiry while maintaining a robust spiritual life, which in some ways demands clinging to something which is either known or experienced? What does it look like in postmodernity to cultivate a spiritual life while alongside that philosophical inquiry?
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about this? Is the philosopher's trick to kind of ask a question to play for time to think. But can you say a little bit more about what you mean by spiritual life?
Okay, so I have to bifurcate my intellectual and spiritual life.
Right.
When I pray as if divinity is in control of the world.
Okay.
And intervenes and engages. And I pray in such a way that I actually believe that when I'm praying. But when I think and I'm not praying, I believe if there is a God, that God has stepped away from this world and does not intervene in this world. So I really have a bifurcation. But I think many people are looking for a more holistic approach where what they believe can be integrated with their spiritual practice. And so to hold on to a skepticism around divinity or around the role of Torah, while engaging in some form of traditional or progressive model of Jewish ritual life.
So I think I'll say something about kind of texts and then something about actually what this can look like in practice, at least for someone like me, which I recognize may have relevance no relevance beyond me, maybe not even relevance within me. So I think one of the resources that the Jewish philosophical tradition offers, and it's a resource not just for Jews, but I think for the Western philosophical tradition, is a rich set of reflections on practice, right? All of the thinkers in the history of modern, or at least most thinkers in the history of Jewish philosophy, have to ask some version of the question you just asked. They have to reflect on why if I'm a philosopher, should I ever participate in a synagogue? Why should I ever pray? For some, why should I follow halakha? For some, why should I follow a more progressive model of practice? But that question, because Judaism has constructed itself as a tradition of focused on practice, there is a long, rich tradition of asking the question, if I can't have a kind of fairly simplistic understanding of a God out there who hears my prayers and is in full control of the world and responds to my particular desires, why engage in any of these practices at all? Maimonides asked that question, Mendelssohn asked that question, Hermann Cohen asked that question, all the way down. So first, we're lucky in the Jewish tradition to have a long series of texts reflecting on this question. In terms of what this might look like in practice, right? So one way to think about practice that works for someone like a Mendelssohn, and I think sometimes works for someone like me, is to actually see practice as a space to ask these questions, right? So one approach could be to say, I engage in these practices because I believe certain things. I believe that God is in control of the world. Therefore, I'm going to engage in practices that reflect a sense that God is in control of the world. Another way to engage in practice would be to say, actually thinking about God is hard. Asking questions about God is hard. We live in a world where very little about our day-to-day lives encourages us to step back from our careers, the logistics of our lives, trying to kind of make a living. Very little encourages us to step back from that and actually ask big questions. And one way that we could look at kind of Jewish practice is actually as a space that forces us to do that, as a space that, with some degree of regularity, and that regularity will vary based on where you are in the Jewish world, but it's a space that forces us with some degree of regularity to actually step back and engage in reflection and engage in questioning. And it can be questioning that leads to revisions, right? So Mendelssohn, for example, imagines Jewish practice as a set of spaces that allows us to constantly refine our understanding of key concepts like God and the soul. Right? The advantage of Jewish practice is it doesn't force us to affirm a particular creed, but actually creates a space where we can constantly reimagine across time and in our own lives. So that to me is one way of thinking about the integration of philosophy and practice, right? Practice can be the space where we ask questions, right? Philosophy is hard. We don't have time in most of our lives, right? Even as someone who teaches Jewish philosophy, right? There are lots of other things I spend my time doing, responding to emails, organizing meetings and things like that. And this becomes religious practice can become a space to ask the questions you might not ordinarily be able to ask.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, that makes me think of Heschel's point that high holidays actually it should bring out more questions than answers in us. Whereas many I think go in and say I'm going to cultivate or inculcate something I already know. So I think and I think actually we're touching on another risk to add to the beginning, which is that the realm of philosophy can be, one might fear, replace the realm of praxis. I need not engage. I will merely sort of analyze from a distance. And I think that you've made a wonderful case and an honest case for what it means to have a more coherent approach and a more reflective approach. So thank you. Thank you for this.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to kind of think about these issues.
Encourage folks to check out Professor Sachs's wonderful writings on Jewish philosophy.